Mr. Williams there about, the smoke and mirrors thing, especially since the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had told reporters ahead of the NATO Defense Ministries meeting that a defense spending commitment of 5% of GDP across NATO alliance is going to happen. Do you believe this is something that's achievable, or are they going to try to find a smoke and mirrors stance, as Mr. Williams put it?
So I agree with most of the arguments advanced by the great Nicholas Williams in Brussels, who knows a lot about NATO from the outside and from the inside. I think, Trump, yes, is transactional, and on the other hand, what the Europeans are doing is partly, of course, delusional, partly propaganda, smoke and mirrors. Let's not, 7 years ago when Trump said he wanted them to raise their military spending, let's not forget, most of them mocked him. So actually, they literally made fun of Trump, saying that he was an imbecile, an idiot, and that they didn't need to increase their military spending as a percentage of GDP. Here they are, 6-7 years later, scrambling to do what Trump wants, or to pretend to do half of what Trump was. So it shows that, even though he may not seem to be a great long-term planner with a perfectly hatched plan, Trump succeeds very often, and the people who mock him 5-6 years later, they eventually submit to him. Another angle which is interesting is, initially, so a year ago, there were some policymakers in Sweden and South Korea and France, like Macron in France, who were saying, great, if the Europeans raise their military spending, and if Trump comes back to the White House, and he came back to the White House 5 months ago, great, because they hate Trump. Therefore, the Poles and the Dutch and the Belgians are going to run to Sweden and France, and they're going to buy advanced weapons and fighter jets from Dassault or from some French or Swedish company. Nothing of that happened. By a cruel irony, the most recent military procurement contracts written and paid for by Polish and Belgian and Dutch taxpayers were all awarded to American weapon manufacturers. None was given to the Swedes and the French. So another commercial, material victory for Trump. He's getting money. So from the fact that the Europeans are making a big budget effort, raising taxes, scrambling to raise military spending, all that money is going to Washington State, Boeing, Seattle, Ohio, Texas. It's not going to military manufacturers in England or France or Sweden.
Okay, Mr. Williams, can we get your take here as well? You were saying there's going to be some sort of smoke and mirrors show happening. But assuming that this isn't a bluff and this isn't something that is going to, end transactionally as it usually does with Trump, and the US decides to pull out, drastically from NATO, how is this going to affect the Europeans, especially given what's happening between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think they're frightened. As I said, they face a threefold attack by Trump. They're trying to appease Trump, which is never a very good idea, in my opinion, because it feeds his narcissistic tendencies and his desire or his belief that he can do anything he wants. But the Europeans, all Europeans, are trying to appease him, and the test will be his presence in The Hague at the end of this month, and whether he plays along with the idea that, yes, he's got NATO to do what he wants, and therefore he can mark off a victory. That's a high-risk strategy for the Europeans, but it's the only strategy they know. They can't actually threaten the United States. It's not within their concept. It's not within their field of vision. So they can only appease the United States. And I think this is an error.
Okay, Mr. Firzli, now Donald Trump has previously said the US won't protect those who don't pay. How should this be interpreted when it comes to negotiating? Is this a tactic or a threat, really, to the NATO unity?
It's because, Trump, with all his faults, realized that 25, 30 years after the end of the World War, the Cold War, 1989, 1990. So, as the French say, the raison d'être, the reason for NATO's presence was to fight the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1990. So this is why, cynically maybe, in a Machiavellian, aggressive way, maybe, Trump is saying, we've been paying for something which doesn't serve its intent, its purpose. Atlantic. What does it mean, Atlantic? Atlantic means, in ancient Greek, the ocean connecting Iceland, Greenland, to France, Spain, Morocco, the Atlantic Ocean, right? Ukraine has nothing to do with the Atlantic Ocean. So clearly, over the years, in a very arbitrary way, NATO has expanded its reach, expanded its original intent, and they have infringed on Eastern European.
But wasn't this, mainly due to sort of American push, not under Donald Trump, but Ukraine is due to a lot of pushing from the Americans for them to ascend into NATO. So essentially, it's still part of the American strategy.
Yes. Yes, you're right. The previous administrations, be they Democrats or Republicans, they were neocons. They were neoconservatives. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Obama, Hillary Clinton. They believed in NATO. They loved NATO because they're neoconservatives. Trump and his people are from a completely different school of thought. So they're saying, wait a minute, game over. It should have stopped in 1990. We're paying for something that doesn't reward us because our interests now are in the Asia-Pacific area, the techno-industrial war, Cold War II against China. If the Europeans want to keep it, quite frankly, let them pay for it.
Yes.
And of course, the Europeans are shocked because they were used to Dick Cheney and Hillary Clinton clapping and saying, bravo, Europe, NATO is great, we love you. And all of a sudden, 5 months ago, enters the White House someone who's the complete opposite culturally, politically, ideologically to George Bush and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. So of course the Europeans are in shock. They're in a state of shock.
Okay, Mr. Williams, Ukraine is invited to the upcoming summit in The Hague by the end of this month. Could this signal NATO's intentions to fast-track Kyiv's membership, despite Moscow's red lines and repeated warnings? And what does this mean for future negotiations or relations with the US, who has been pushing for a ceasefire there?
Again, the short answer to you is no. It doesn't mean the fast track to Ukraine's NATO membership. I think behind the scenes there was a struggle. The Americans didn't want Ukraine or Zelensky to be mentioned or to be present at all in this summit. And they wanted to focus on the finances and the what we've called transactional business of 3%, 3.5%, 5%. I don't know what the debate is at the present. But they, as a compromise, and this is how the Europeans consider to be it to be a major victory for the Europeans, Zelensky will be invited to a dinner or a lunch. So it's just again performative and symbolic, minor European victories against a major American pressure for doing more on defense and distancing the Americans from the hard business of defense in Europe.